Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on our presentation on astrology today. On behalf of the Harvard Club of the United Kingdom, I want to introduce our speaker, Dr. Tamara Howard. I'm Vicky Leung. I'm the co-chair of events for the Harvard Club. Tamara is a college alumna and a member of the board of the club, where she spearheads our public services program. Tamara has been practicing astrology since she was 10, following her mother's footsteps. She graduated from Harvard in 1975 and then got a PhD from Tufts Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences. She's worked in the technology, biotech, life sciences, and consulting services industries. She's a published author and runs her own consulting firm specializing in the technology and biotech sectors. Astrology is no doubt a controversial subject. Some of you may think that it has no scientific merit, and others may believe that celestial bodies do affect our personalities and events. Tamara will discuss the history and influence of this field and take her questions after the presentation. Please use the chat function to post your questions at any time, or just raise your hand during the Q&A session at the end. Please note that this presentation is being recorded. And now over to Tamara. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I somehow did something so I can't see my own face on the screen, which is great, but I hope you can all see it. If you can't, say something in the chat room. You should also be able to see right now two fish on the screen that say, you're a Pisces, I'm a Pisces too. So if anyone doesn't see that, let me know. So otherwise I'll assume all is good and we're off to go. Now, I was talking to Vicky a while ago about the challenge of making presentations interesting and different when everybody's getting zoomed out. And I said to her, well, I'm an astrologer. I could always talk about astrology. And she said, that'd be great. So that's why I'm here today. So this thing, you're a Pisces, I'm a Pisces too, I assume is what most people think of when they think of astrology. And that's people's sun signs. So I'm a Gemini, or I'm a Libra, or I'm a Pisces. But there's ever so much more to astrology than just the sun sign. And in fact, sun sign astrology is really very, very modern in the scope of things. So what I'm going to do when I talk a little bit about what astrology is, how it's practiced, I'm going to start with the journey of where it's come from. So you can see how different bits and pieces have been added to it today. So I'm going to now see if I can master, which is what I just said. And I will talk about ultimately how it's used by different astrologers today, because it's not just one thing. So I guess people have been looking at the stars no matter where they were, well, since mankind came to be. I'm just trying to see if I can manage the devices on the bottom here. You can see astrology that we know of because of written evidence carved in stone or whatever, grew up independently in at least 5 places around the world. There's the famous Mayan calendar, and Mayans practiced astrology. The Egyptians practiced astrology, as they did in the whole Mesopotamian area. And I'm going to focus on these 2 areas in a bit more detail. Indian astrology has been around since at least 2000 BCE and is still practiced as it's been practiced continuously since that time. And then there's Chinese astrology, which everyone's heard. I think we just entered the year of the ox, is another completely separate system, which grew up independently. There are talks of other forms of astrology, but most of the areas where that was done had an oral culture. So there's not a lot left that can be investigated from it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on Western astrology, because each of these astrologies, the Mayan, which is no longer practiced clearly, the Chinese, the Indian, and then Western astrology, they are all a very different tradition and they're practiced different ways. And if you're an astrologer in one tradition, you can't just switch to the other. It's very challenging. So I'm going to focus on this area here, which has become the basis for astrology as is practiced in the West, I will say. So North and South America and Europe and Australia and bits of Asia as well have picked it up. Okay. Hold on. There we go. So Astrology as it is today basically came from a combination of both Mesopotamian astrology, which was started about 4,000 years ago in 2000 BCE. There's evidence of cuneiform scratchings on tablets that are dated about that far back, and the Egyptian astrology. So let me talk about the Mesopotamian one first, because these are both important to understand how we came to be doing what we're doing today. Initially, astrologers who were astronomers, as we know it, they stared at the stars, they made notations of what was where in the sky. They stuck these notations in a room that became libraries. And they also noted when, say, an eclipse was in the sky in a certain region and the king died. And they began to collect bits of information over the years. In fact, the first known ephemeris, which is a book that tells you where planets were at a given time and where planets will be at a given time, was created in Mesopotamia thousands of years ago. It was the birth of something that's practiced today by some astrologers called mundane astrology. Mundane astrology is astrology of large groups of people. That's things like countries, cities, even regions. And it was the astrologers in that area, as they began to develop the skills, were supported basically by the rulers. They had an elevated position. They were given livings to collect data, put them in these libraries, and forecast on behalf of the ruler. Some of the things that were forecast, of course, were around wars and would you win and would you lose. And a lot of it was also forecast with things like plagues, large events like how the crops are going to do. That's all considered mundane astrology. And as I said, there's still a group that practice primarily mundane astrology today. Oh, I don't know if I said it, the weather is also comes through mundane astrology. The Mesopotamians, basically, when they were collecting data, they looked at the movement of these moving stars, these wandering stars, as they were later called, against the backdrop of the sky. And the word for wanderer is crudely planets. I'm just talking about the modern version of the word. I'm not going to try any Greek or any other language. And so when I talk about planets now, I'm going to refer to even the sun and moon as a planet, even though I know it's not, because in astrological terms, it was one of the wandering bodies across the sky that was noted. And they tended to look at these observations over the course of a year, where things were in the sky as the year went on. Egyptian astrology began a little bit later, probably 1,000 years later or so. It, rather than being based on the movement of planets over the course of a year, it was based on 24-hour periods, and it divided the sky into 36 pieces and basically noted what fixed stars and where planets were over the course of that 24-hour period. It was used initially basically as a clock to schedule religious ceremonies at auspicious times. Now, it's interesting, this was a 24-hour mapping and a 365-day mapping. Eventually, they merged. Now, how did that happen? Come on, oops, pressing the wrong button on this. There we go. Well, in around 300 BCE, Alexander the Great started taking over the world as he knew it. And his troops spread from present-day Macedonia, as it says there, across all of the Middle East and as far as, in fact, the tip of India, bits of India. It also went down into Egypt. When this happened over the course of the following few hundred years, Greek became the common language across these areas. Anyone who was educated or anyone who was anybody could also speak Greek. And cultures and ideas began to consolidate, and astrology began to coalesce as well. It took a couple of hundred years, but the 365-day way of viewing things and the 24-hour way of viewing things integrated. And between them, they developed what are now the 4 cornerstones of modern astrology. This period, because of the Greek, is characterized by the Hellenistic period of astrology, which started crudely with the invasions of Alexander the Great and carried on until roughly the fall of the Roman Empire. The Romans adopted it as the Greeks declined, and it carried on until the fall of the Roman Empire. But basically what they began to do was standardize things around planets. And as I said, for astrology, that includes the sun and the moon, the zodiac, which is 12 constellations. I'm going to talk about each of these with a picture in a little bit more detail because it's easier to see. Something called the houses of the chart and their meanings, and then aspects between planets. So there were bits and pieces of these, as is evidenced by writings and hieroglyphics and scratchings on tombs and things. But it was formally consolidated during this Hellenistic period and integrated the Egyptian and the Mesopotamian forms of astrology. So planets, the 7 original planets were the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And up until the 20th century, these were all that astrologers used. There are clearly a lot more techniques and things going on, but these are really the basics, and everyone had to understand the basics. So the planets were one of the things that were agreed on at this stage. The next was the zodiac. Now, you can see a small picture of Earth here and the sun here. And what the zodiac is when you look at the sun, the constellation that appears behind it as you look into the sky. That is if it's daylight and you can see it. But that is in principle what's happening. So that is the sun in Leo, so to speak. But it happens with any of the other planets that are between Earth and the constellation. And that's how you decide basically what the zodiac is. Now, where I'm going through this quickly, but why these constellations? Because there are actually a lot more constellations out there. And by the way, the constellations were split into 30 equal degrees, but you can see some of the constellations are tiny and some of them are quite large, and in terms of space take up a whole lot more space. But to mark out areas of the sky, they basically are indicators of what area of the sky you're talking about. And for astrological purposes, even a couple thousand years ago, basically things were split into 30-degree segments. I'm just going to give a little bit of an explanation for how we got that. I mean, there's stars everywhere, absolutely everywhere. But if you look at the Earth and it's tilted on its axis, and you extend the equator out, you get this dotted line, which is the celestial equator. So you sort of tilt your head sideways. But the sun itself doesn't move along the equator. It moves along something called the ecliptic. And it was those planets that are essentially, those constellations that are on the ecliptic that we were looking at when we looked at the zodiac before. And you can see that in September, when the ecliptic crosses the celestial equator, and the same again in March, this is when we get the equinoxes. Right, so we said that planets were one thing, the zodiac was another. Meanings of the houses, well, a lot of these seem to be derived originally from the Egyptian contribution, because they divided the sky into 36 zones at the time. And I know the chart's a bit cheesy, but it was the best I could find. So they divided it into 36 zones, and they began to notice, oh, well, when this planet is here, it usually has something to do with a ruler dying, or when this planet is here, it usually has something to do with a partner or marriage, or when this planet is here, it has to do with poor health. And over again, hundreds of years, people began to collect through observations meanings to the different areas in the chart. So these are the houses of an astrological chart. And they're not necessarily, the zodiac can appear anywhere on them, but I will go through that a little bit later. And the final thing, which I didn't talk about, but will explain, is aspects, which are the distances between planets, also play a role in how easily or difficultly they seem to work together. Okay, so we had the Hellenistic period, which lasted for a good few hundred years and provided the foundation by which a lot of astrology today works. But after the fall of the Roman Empire, concomitant with the rise of the Christian church, astrology in Europe tended to take a nosedive. But fortunately, for astrology anyway, from Saudi Arabia, the Muslim groups began to, I'm sure there are technical names for the different groups, but I'm sorry, I don't know them, began to invade other sections of the world. They got again as far as India, through northern Africa and most of Spain, not quite all of it, but most of Spain. And as part of this, there were some rulers that were very, very interested in philosophy and science, which astrology was considered part of, and medicine. And they set up universities, a particularly good one in Baghdad, and began to translate a lot of works they got from India, from Sanskrit, from the Hellenistic period in Greek, and translated everything that was around into Arabic. And there was a real blossoming of astrology amongst this group from the in the 7th and 8th century. I've got to say it correctly. I want to say AD, but 7th and 8th century after BCE. How's that? So I just can't think of the words. So that went on for a while, for quite a while, many hundreds of years, and it produced some excellent works of astrology. And then, as the Arabic or Muslim invasions of Spain began to recede, interestingly enough, a lot of scholars went to Spain, where a lot of these books existed, and began to translate them into Latin, because at the time of that time, astrology was considered the sort of holistic scientific practice that pulled together medicine, science, cosmology, philosophy. And there was another renaissance of astrology in the 12th century that carried on until about the 17th century. Now, one thing I neglected to say, so we had mundane astrology way back in the Mesopotamian period, but toward the end of that period, when they began to make ephemeris, and the ephemeris will tell you both forward and backwards where any of the planets are going to be, you suddenly began to get the birth of what's known as natal astrology. And that's the astrology that says you can tell something about the quality of a person, their life, and key events by looking at the time, place, and date of their birth. So it was Mesopotamia that started that, and then was built on in a big way in the Hellenistic period. In addition to that, there were two other practices. Well, one other that became big, and that was electional astrology, probably driven by rulers. And that's where you go to an astrologer and say, what's the best day to start a war? What's the best day to get married? What's the best day to get crowned king? And it's difficult to do that sort of thing without an ephemeris, because you have to look at all the options that are available to you. Okay, so then we move into the Renaissance period. Astrology is used quite a lot with medicine, as is herbalists. So you have Culpeper's herbal, he practiced astrology as well. It was commonly done to treat and diagnose conditions in the, well, what I call it's the medieval period and early Renaissance. The other kind of astrology that really took off in this period, particularly in England, was the fourth type of astrology, which is called horary astrology. And this is the astrology of asking questions. So people could come to you and say, my cat is missing, will it come home? And a horary astrologer would cast a chart for the moment he or she was asked, and would tell you yes or no, or will come home injured, or will give you an answer. And this was very, very popular in England in the 17th century, particularly. Why is that? Well, probably in part because horary astrology is very quick. You get an answer, you cast a chart, you look, you get an answer. The other kinds of astrology take a lot more time and a lot more effort. So if somebody is trying to earn a living as an astrologer, and there were people that did, horary is probably the quickest and easiest way at that time to earn a living. So astrology carried on pretty successfully until the end of the 17th century. And then it basically fell out of favor for 200 years. I could suggest why. I'm not sure it's important. I think it was kind of the split between the rationalists and the Enlightenment and the church, and they divvied up things like religion and was the purview of the church, and anything rational was the purview of science and or the state. And astrology, again, straddled the line at the time. And so it was hard to know where to put it, so they didn't. Now, I should also say that up until this time, basically, most astrologers were men. Not all, but most, because they had to know a significant amount of math and geometry and science of the time in order to even calculate a chart. There were no computers then to do it easily. So they were men, very well educated men up until this point. So John Ashmole of the Ashmolean Museum, for example, in Oxford, was an astrologer. And some of the people that everyone looks to as astronomers were in fact astrologers. So people like Galileo was practiced astrology, as did his daughter. And Copernicus practiced astrology. So all of these people, you had to learn astronomy to practice astrology. It was part of the discipline, but some of them began to focus more on the astronomy part, but they still were practicing astrologers. So in the mid 18th century, well, in the 18th century that followed, astrology basically survived as a topic in almanacs, like the best time to plant. And almanacs were very popular, particularly in the United States. So there were still people practicing it, but more of them were, now that you have printing presses and printed matter widely available, trying to make a living by writing almanacs. And they did a bit of mundane astrology on the weather and planting and crops. So then what happened? The 21st century. Now, this is an interesting time. Astrology began to come alive again, but from a completely different direction. Originally, it was very much tied into philosophy and science, but it got resurrected in the mid to late 19th century as part of the spiritualist movement, which suddenly became big and revived all sorts of things along with it, like tarot and Ouija boards and seances, and astrology was in that list. So suddenly it's associated with, nothing wrong with any of those, by the way, but it's now associated with alternative things rather than science. And furthermore, when it really starts to come into its own again around the turn of the 20th century, so the early 1910, 1920, there were still an awful lot of laws that considered it fortune telling, and you could be put into jail and fined heavily. So what a lot of these people began to do was say, well, really, I'm just describing personalities. And this went along really well because it was the time of the rise of the psychotherapists, Freud and Jung and all of those people, this new science, which was also considered dodgy at the time it started. And so everyone was into describing personalities and introspection and personality issues, and it got around some of the more onerous laws, but not always. As it went along in the 1930s, I think was the first time it happened, a newspaper decided to introduce a sun sign column, because you don't need to go to an ephemeris, you don't need to consult an astrologer to know what your sun sign is, because you can look that up from the day you're born. So you may not know where your Venus, your Mars, your Jupiter, your Neptune, or anything else is, but you sure know where your sun sign is. And so they began running sun sign columns, and they were very, very popular and have been popular ever since. So that's why I had the Pisces slide to begin with. It's what most people know astrology for and think of when they think astrology. Not everyone, but a lot of people. So from the 1990s onward, a couple of other things happened. First of all, you got computers. When I first learned to draw a chart, I had to have all sorts of specialist books. I had to do maths before I even knew what the maths was. I think it involved logarithms when I was 10 years old. And in order to calculate a birth chart, and it took me hours and hours. Now you can just press a button. Doing the chart isn't that difficult. It's the interpretation of it that's the skill. The other interesting thing that happened a little before the 1990s, but in earnest with the 1990s, is a lot of astrologers wanted to understand what came before. And they went back to school to study ancient Greek as opposed to Greek, to learn Aramaic. They learned medieval Latin. There's one place in the States where you can get an advanced degree in that. It's a Catholic university. And other specialists, Sanskrit. And they went back to the original texts and began translating them. So now we have about 25 years worth of good translations of some of the leading authors from the Hellenistic period and from the Arabic period in terms of astrology, and a few other odds and sods in Hebrew, and a few other places where things had been translated along the way. It's really fascinating when you're learning how to interpret, because if you hear someone that speaks both, well, can read both Latin and ancient Greek, or Arabic and ancient Greek, they talk about how things were, the same texts were translated differently, and it's caused all sorts of issues and arguments amongst astrologers in later years. But the key thing about this is to say that in the 21st century, astrology now is a blend of ancient and modern techniques and approaches. And we're now having available all of them, and we don't have to spend quite so much time on all of the calculations, because there are a few very good astrological software solutions that will do the calculations for you. So let's have a look at a chart, shall we? So what is an astrology chart? It's essentially a snapshot in time. It's calculated for the place you were born, and it's a record of the sky at the time and place you were born, and time. And time is very important, and a bit of a pain in England because it's not recorded on birth certificates. It's said by astrologers that the chart encapsulates the quality of the moment, and that's why horary works. And one of the reasons I decided to study horary as well as the other things I've studied is because I thought, well, it either works or it doesn't. If this technique is any good, I'll know it quickly, because once you learn it, you can see whether you can predict whether the cat returns, or you can find the missing earring, or whatever it is the question was. Otherwise it sounds totally absurd when you first look at it. Why can you set up a chart for the moment somebody asks you a serious question and have it be effective? But I can tell you it works, and it shocked me. So there you go. So this is a chart for now, basically. Oh, that was prescient of me. Anyway, it's an astrological chart for from my house where I am in Goring-on-Thames at 6:30 today. And what it represents, this represents the horizon. Okay, so that if you were watching throughout the day, the sun would come here in the morning as it rose. Excuse me. Yet here is the highest point. And when it sets, come here. So the sun being here tells me it's dark outside. It's nighttime because everything under here is in the night sky below the horizon. Now, what I've got on this chart as well is some of the modern planets. So we talked about the sun, Venus, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Saturn, and where's Jupiter gone? Oh, and Jupiter. But since then, some more planets have been discovered. Uranus in the 1780s, Neptune in the 1840s, and Pluto around 1930. And yes, I know there's a thing with astronomers about, is Pluto a planet? But it's pretty effective in its use in astrology, so it is. This is probably the best place to talk about aspects. That's what these lines are. And it's saying here that the Moon and Uranus are in a square, amazingly, aspect to Saturn, because they're 1, 2, 3, 4 signs away out of 12, and the same degree. And that means something in how you interpret them. There are a lot of other aspects as well. This one is in opposition. This chart doesn't have any of the easy aspects. In fact, if you'd asked me, should I pick tonight? This is probably the worst night this month I could possibly have done this. So there we go, for a variety of reasons, but I'm here. So there we go. It will teach me to actually use astrology a bit more in my life. Okay, so what are people doing today and what is it? It's a symbolic language, really. It's a predictive tool. And the predictive tool can be used to, and there's a variety of different things, it can be used to describe personalities. And there's a whole school of astrology that spends all of its efforts just on that. It's called psychological astrology. A subdivision of that really is synastry, which is describing compatibility in relationships. I tell you, I used synastry a lot when I was working in large corporates to figure out the best way to deal with my boss and to get the most out of the people that worked for me. It's not manipulating, it's just understanding where their hot buttons are and what they're good at. It's been used to help in the diagnosis of disease. And yes, believe it or not, there still are medical astrologers today. Although if you go to one, most of them are also herbalists, and they see something, they'll tell you to consult your regular physician as well. But it's also an interesting field. I am not that experienced in it because I did go to medical school and I did get a PhD in that area, and I just get confused. You have to go into a completely different paradigm to deal with it. And I mix the two up, I must admit. Mundane astrology is still used widely in forecasting elections, in issues of countries, cities, large groups of people. A subset of that is forecasting weather and agricultural happenings, or things like fires, volcanoes, and earthquakes. And I noticed the volcano today is right on time. What do I mean by that? I don't know if I can go backwards on this. Hold on. Previous slide. Yeah, because this aspect here in this particular sign, squaring this aspect, is a real key one for volcanoes and earthquakes. So, and it's going to be in position for at least a week or so, if not more. So Mount Etna blasting off was really right on time. There's also business astrology, and there are quite a few people that focus on that. Some of it's stock market, and some of it's just commercial trends. So I know some astrologers, they're employed by businesses as consultants, and that's as far as the talk goes, where they'll talk about what business areas, or what companies even, because companies have charts, are likely to be doing well or poorly. And they make a fine living out of it. Some of them work for like hedge funds and investment funds as well to talk about what areas are worth investing in. Then in a subset of natal astrology, which you didn't have on this list, is predictive astrology. So not only can you talk about somebody's personality, but you can talk about, you wouldn't do it every day, but you can talk about times of change, or things coming up ahead, good times to do things, bad times to do things. Astrologers will argue about why this is and what it is. I tend to think of it, a bit like Shakespeare when he said there's a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. I just think there are times when you should know you can go with the flow, and others when you're fighting against, the current. I've already discussed horary astrology, which is the astrology of asking specific questions. And electional astrology, which is selecting an optimum time to do something, like setting up a business or establishing a wedding, because it is in fact the birth chart of that entity. Now, I started with sun sign astrology. It's a subtype of the predictive and the psychological astrology. People make a very good living doing it. It appeals to the masses, basically, which is fine. It's not as detailed or intricate as doing a whole chart, but quite often the kind of people that want to do sun sign astrology aren't interested in the greater detail, is all I can say. So I said I would take 40 minutes, so that I left 20 minutes for questions. I'm trying to do, when I gave an astrology course, it was like 20 weeks for 3 hours a session. So I can talk more about history. I can talk more about astrology. I can talk more about techniques. There's almost no astrologer that can do all of these techniques well. Most people are aware of them and know the basics of how to do them. But to be really good at it, it takes a lot of training and a lot of experience and a lot of use. So it's a bit of a science and a bit of an art. So I would say, what is science? Is astrology a science? Well, yes and no, I think. It's based upon factual things like the movement of the planets. Everybody can see it. That's ultimately turned into its own science of astronomy, but it was once fundamental to astrology. Well, it still is fundamental to astrology. What am I saying? But there is still the art of interpretation. So I guess you could say, and people are going to jump down my throat, it's a bit like medicine, which is based on science as far as it goes. But still, it's down to the experience and skill of the person who is trying to diagnose it to figure out what's going on. So back over to Vicky to deal with questions. That is 4,000 years in 40 minutes.
Thank you so much, Tamara. That was absolutely fascinating. I'd always found it intriguing, never thought of it as a discipline. To put it in such an academic perspective is really enlightening. We have a couple of questions in the chat room, so I'll ask those first. I'll take questions in turn, and if you wish to raise your hand, please go ahead. I will call you after I ask the written questions, because they did come first. So the first one, Tamara, is from Max. How is a precession, the wobbling of Earth, accommodated into astrology? For example, traditional astrology says that March the 21st and April 19th, the sun is in Aries. Today, the sun is no longer in Aries. March 11th to April 18th, the sun is actually in Pisces.
Yes, I know. Okay, so let me tell you how that works. It is taken into account. In fact, that wobble is part of what accounts for this 2,000-year business, so that you have the age of Pisces and then the age of Aquarius as things slowly shift. You're right, that backdrop that I talked about, without going backwards too much, let's see if I can master this, is previous. Sorry, I'm just going previous. Ooh. Oh, well, I won't bother. The backdrop where I talked about the sun against the constellations, that was the way it was about 2,000 years ago, when in March, approximately 0 degrees of Aries would have been the start, and the sun would have corresponded to the zodiac. Since then, because of that bulge and wobble, everything has shifted about 7 astronomical minutes a year. So it's very slow, but it still shifts. So what's happened is there are 2 schools of astrology. There are many schools. In India, where they do another type of astrology that I mentioned, they still stick to the traditional horoscope, but their planets are 23 degrees behind our planets. Okay, so if somebody is, say, 15 degrees Cancer in Western astrology, they would be considered whatever 15 minus 23, something like 15 degrees, or no, 25 degrees Gemini in Indian astrology, because that astrology works with the actual zodiac as you see it in the sky. What what Western astrologers decided to do was start everything at the spring equinox. And so regardless of what's behind it, they call it Aries, but regardless of the constellation behind it now, they mark the sky off in 30-degree increments till they go all the way around. And the first 30 degrees is deemed to be Aries, even though probably it's mostly Pisces behind it. But as I said, these are both notations to indicate a point in the sky. The actual constellations are nowhere near the sizes of the 30 degrees. It was just a way of originally mapping the sky. Does that answer?
Yeah, I think Max is muted. So yeah, but that's brilliant. I mean, it's I couldn't even paraphrase that question. It's so technical. Thank you for asking it. The second question is for Marian. Might you talk a little bit more about the training and education in astrology, please?
Right. Well, as it turns out, if you live in the UK, you're very blessed because it's one of the hot spots in the world for astrologers. A lot of them come from all over the world and settle here, and has been for a long time. There are at least 3 very good schools of astrology. There's one that focuses on psychological astrology. There's one that focuses on medieval astrology and horary, and there's some that are more general modern astrology. These days, though, most astrologers will work using Zoom and online. So you can take astrological courses from anybody, anywhere in the world, as I have over the last, I don't know, 30 or 40 years. And there are diplomas you can get in this country. There's also some graduate schools. One of them just closed down, but the other one is in Wales, which gives masters and PhDs in astrology and or cosmology, actually, but it's fundamentally astrology. And there's a university in the States, an undergraduate university that does training in astrology, and it covers everything from Indian astrology over the 4 years to Hellenistic astrology to modern, various schools of modern astrology. So they're beginning to try and certify everything, get ethics committees together on what you should and shouldn't do with clients and all that sort of thing, trying to make it as professional as possible. Anything else?
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope that answers the question. Now, if I'm asking your question, we're very happy for you to just unmute yourself and jump in if you want a further clarification and all that. It's just that, I can't see everybody on the screen as Tamara is still sharing her screen. So if you're not happy, if you want more, a longer answer, just, feel free to jump in. I'll just move on to the next question then. It's from Adida. I have the same question as well. Can you please tell us a bit more about rectification? For example, if you don't know your exact time of birth, how do you figure it out?
It's a pain in the whatever. Rectification is when somebody doesn't know the time of day they were born. There's still things you can do with the chart, but not nearly as much as if you know the time. It really helps if you know approximately the time, like my mother said I was born after breakfast sometime. There are techniques where you basically, the older you are, the better, because you go through people's lives and get key dates like birth of siblings, younger siblings, key deaths, marriage, that sort of thing. And you go back and you spend a lot of time playing with the chart to look at what time they must have been born for these events to have happened, so that if you'd started off with the birth chart, you could have forecast those events. But it's really fiddly. I mean, some people do it all the time and are very good at it. For me, rectification, I've done it, I can do it, but I don't like to. And I will do it, especially if someone has a close window. Like I know I was born after midnight, but before the sun came up. So that for me is a close window, and I can work with that. But a 24-hour period is difficult. And for me, it's like electional astrology when somebody says, well, what's the best day to? And there are some years when the planets are in such horrible places, there's no good day to. So all you can do is find the least bad day to do it. And there's a story along electional about Queen Elizabeth, who had an astrologer, a court astrologer. And the story goes, and it may be, it may just be gossip passed around by astrologers, that her astrologer said to her, okay, what do you want? Do you want to be in power for a long, long time? Or do you want to be married with a happy family? Because I can't get the planets to do both. So, and evidently she chose she wanted to be queen for a long, long time. So there goes marriage, we say. So it just has to do with, you have to work with what you're given. She wasn't going to wait 10 years to get the best possible chart. You've got to be practical. Just like people asked me about weddings of a friend who in the end didn't get married. I was so annoyed, it took me so long. And the best possible times were like at 3 a.m. So you can't do that. You have to say, what's the best possible time on a time and day when this sort of thing can be done? So yeah, any more?
Great, yeah. So Ken Hoffman, your question is the same as Adida, so I'm going to skip over it. Okay, here's a question. Could you tell us more about synastry and how do you or others use it? And also, apologies for the silly question, are tarot cards based on some kind of astrological rules? It's not silly.
Well, some people say they are and some people say they aren't. A lot of astrologers just do astrology. They don't do everything else. And many of the others investigate all the other things like tarot cards and stuff. So I have investigated tarot cards. I don't like doing them much because I prefer something that's really solid, that doesn't rely too much on intuition. There's nothing wrong with them. There are lots of very good tarot readers, but astrology you've got the planets there, the place there, and a whole set of rules, and you follow them. And it just suits my temperament better than trying to intuit something from a picture. But I can do it. So what was the other question? Oh, synastry. Yes, synastry is really interesting because you look at you can think of each of the planets as a kind of a drive that's intrinsic to you. So the sun might be your ego or personality. The moon might be your maternal instincts, your homing instincts. Venus might be, it's a lot of things. I'm really simplifying it, but might be the desire you have to mingle or mix with people or love, or Mars is your aggression, etc. So you sit there and say, well, first of all, look at how the person's own chart goes, because if they have conflicting things in their own chart that they can't resolve, you can be sure that no matter how good they get on with somebody else, they're going to have conflicting things with the other chart. But basically what you're trying to do is marry up some of these key planets like the sun and Venus and Mars and the moon, so that there's, if you're talking about a sexual relationship, so that there's sexual chemistry, that's Venus and Mars, and that there's a kind of an empathy. You would also like to see Mercury, which rules communication, in good aspect, because everything else can be good, but if you have Mercury in bad aspect, it generally means there are challenges communicating with each other effectively. So those are the sort of things you look at. I'm really oversimplifying it. Now, my little brother calls me up every time he's dating somebody new and says, do the chart. And what I have to say to him every time is, look, you have issues in your own chart. And until you get these resolved, you're simply going to project some of your issues onto this person. But let me tell you the areas that work well and the areas that will be a bit of a challenge, and you decide, don't blame me. So that's what I say. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Moving on. Oh, hi, Wenta. So is there any empirical evidence that the zodiac signs actually work as a predictor of personality?
Well, zodiac signs, what is personality? There was in the 1950s and 60s a French couple, Gauquelin, who collected tons and tons of information about scientists, about God, what's the word I want? Athletes, successful athletes, successful scientists, etc. And he got their birth data and he mapped it, and he saw that the ones that were successful had certain planets in certain zones in the chart statistically. And he started a school of astrology. I haven't told you how factional this is, school of astrology called neo-astrology, in which he said, unless something can be proved and demonstrated, it's not worth looking at. So that was what he tried to do back in the 60s or so. And there were some interesting things he pointed out. I suppose the other people that sometimes use them are insurance companies. I mean, there are some signs that are more inclined to have car accidents, for example, and some that are less inclined. And basically, if something saves somebody money, they'll always consider looking at it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I'll move on to Sarah's question. I'm just guessing that this is Sarah Ruckheimer, astronomer,
Yeah.
astrophysicist.
Yes,
Guessing.
I'm an astrophysicist. Yeah, that's me. Yeah.
Would you like to ask a question, Sarah?
Yes, I'm very skeptical of astrology as an astrophysicist, and I guess my question is more: is there any scientific evidence that astrology has predictive power, especially when you blind yourself and you remove your confirmation bias? So kind of doing a double-blinded setup where you don't know, maybe you do readings across a whole, assuming a whole different birth locations and times, and see which reading actually fits the person objectively better with trying to remove your own human bias as much as possible, and any bias that you might have in the interpretation of assessing your accuracy of the reading.
Well, confirmation bias is really a challenge for a lot of things, especially when people are predicting elections, because they constantly try and see things so that their candidate wins. They just, they can't be objective enough. Have there been? Well, I was going to say that for me, horary astrology was it, which is, you make a prediction and either it's right or it's wrong. And not all astrologers are good, by the way. It's like not all doctors are good, not all anybody is good. But there are, if you go to a good astrologer and they make predictions, which are usually not, you will break your foot tomorrow. They're more in the area of, I see issues with a possible accident over the next week, whether it's your foot or not, it might be. And that's how it's usually done. All I can say is from my observation, it seems to work. Whether I'm, laden with confirmation bias or not, I can't say, but I was a scientist, so I do try and look at these things that way. I'm not sure. You see, I don't think astrology is causal. Some of it is, of course, like when the sun it's springtime, the sun's out more, and in the summer it's hot. Okay, so that's one direct effect of planets on Earth. But the other stuff, I'm not sure it's causal. I'm not convinced it's like a big clock, perhaps, which gives you indications of timing of things, or, synchronicity. I don't know, but it does. All I can say is it seems to work. I mean, I don't know why in physics force equals mass times acceleration, but it works. Everyone accepts it. But why should that work? Why not force equals mass times velocity? Well, I mean, it doesn't work. But I mean, again, if you keep going back and asking the whys, then I'm not sure we have an answer to anything. But you're right, there should be some, some way to demonstrate this. And I think a lot of people have, but most people that criticize it actually haven't studied it. So if you're really interested, I would suggest you learn a little bit more about it. And then you can decide for yourself.
Sarah, does that answer your question?
Yes, I guess I'm not so much, I get we don't understand the why. I have yet to see any studies that actually try to remove confirmation bias and do it in an objective way. But I'd be really curious to see those studies if they have been done, and I think we might be able to do this.
Where would you
AI.
go to read the studies? I mean, do you get things like the Astrological Journal or the Journal of the Geocosmical Research Society? The kind of places these things are published are out there, but they're probably not the places you look. And I can't think of any articles offhand because I just haven't been looking for them, but there may well be some, don't know.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to set up a good experiment, a robust experiment, which we might be able to do with like machine learning and actually assessing the taking like a more objective view of these charts. And I think that would be an interesting thing for someone to do.
Yeah, it would. I'm personally have set up to do something slightly different because of course I'm fairly convinced, but I'm there are a lot of techniques that I haven't gone through today, and I'm not sure which ones work better. So I was going to take 12 charts and go through of people I know and that are old like me. So they've had a lot of time in life to have things happen to them. And they've, since I know them all, they've given me all the key and dreadful dates. And then I'm going to go back and test about 7 different forecasting techniques and see if any of them would have predicted it, if all of them. Now, it's not exactly what you're asking for, it's after the fact, but I'm doing it mostly to see if my belief that certain ones are better than others is in fact justified. So.
Okay, Sarah is muted, but thank you very much. I mean, that was a great question, Sarah, and also it's a great response. And I see a couple of participants, jumping in. So, it's a very healthy debate. So thank you very much for asking that, Sarah. Moving on to Lynn's question. As we have more accurate prediction tools like computer modeling, and these tools become more accessible to generic people, do you see the use of astrology becoming more and more niche?
No. In a word, I suppose it all depends on where the computer modeling tools start as their basis, what they're using to model. But no, I don't. That's my bias. I think you can do a lot with AI and computer modeling, but I don't think so. Or I don't think it will minimize astrology. So there we go.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. And then Ilka, if someone knows time interval he or she was born, okay. Right. I think that's been asked already. It's about if you can't nail down your exact timing of birth. Yeah. Right. Okay. Stefan, hi. Thanks for being here. Do you think the COVID pandemic might have been predictable in a way through astrology?
It was.
Yeah. Okay.
It was.
Yeah.
So there are a number of astrologers that did. I mean, pandemics of greater or lesser degrees happen about every 11 or 12 years. You had AIDS in the 80s and you had the SARS and things. But this one was really pointed out by a couple of well-known astrologers as 2020. 2020 had a bunch of really strong, challenging is a nice way of saying aspects in it. We're not through all of them yet this year, but the very worst of them are over, and 2020 was full of it. And it wasn't just COVID, it was also things like disruption, riots all around the world. So these things aren't unique to a particular country, although they can be emphasized in some countries more than others, depending on the chart of the country. That's mundane astrology. You should see the chart for Lebanon for when that big blast happened. It was really interesting because certain planets were in just the right place for a super big blast. So, but on that particular chart.
Okay. And I guess, a lot of people would be interested to hear what you say about, this is the second part of Stefan's question. Are there any signs pointing towards the end of the pandemic? I know you mentioned that, 2020.
Yeah, there are. And then I have a bit of trouble because from a personal thing, I really love pandemics. I've always liked to study pandemics. I have like every book ever written on the 1918 one, and I took them out and reread them. So from a pandemic point of view, they tend to run about 2 years. From an astrological point of view, but as they're running 2 years, toward the end of it, people are working as normal. I mean, it's sort of, the tail end of a curve. So astrologically, what I said to all my friends last summer was, the worst of it will be in like November, December, January. I said, starting in February, because of the number of things that are happening astrologically, we won't be over it, but things should start to look more optimistic. So there I am, I'm making a prediction, Sarah. I'm saying, I don't think we're going to be through the pandemic, but I think things will be a lot more optimistic and people will begin to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And again, I said this before we had any vaccines or anything. It's easy enough to say now, and also in the basis of knowing how pandemics run.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, that's really heartening. Thank you. Now, I'm aware that it's 7 o'clock. People may have other obligations, in which case we understand if you have to leave. But Tamara has said that she doesn't mind going over time. I think we only have maybe 2 more questions. So why don't we just finish those and wrap up afterwards, if that's okay with you. Again, if you have to leave, we understand.
Yeah, fine.
Right. Okay, this one is from Glenn. Would you say that the planets cause human behavior? When does human choice come into play?
Good question. And that was the biggest issue that the Christian church had with astrology, fate or free will. Now you're going to get my personal interpretation. Other astrologers might do it differently. First of all, I don't think it's cause. As I said before, I think it's correlation or synchronistic. I mean, perhaps someday they'll prove a cause, but I don't think so. I think it's like a clock will tell you it's time for lunch. It doesn't cause you to eat lunch, you know, it doesn't cause you to eat dinner, but crudely speaking, you eat dinner at the right time for it. And I think astrology is a bit like a big clock like that. Sorry, what was the rest of the question?
Right, human choice. Yeah, when does
Oh
that?
yeah,
How does that come?
I think from my observation of doing things, there's some people whose charts I've been doing regularly, I don't know, for the past 40 or 50 years. And I think that there's an awful lot of choice, but there are, say, 4 or 5 key points in your life where there isn't. So I would say it's a mix, and that by and large you have free will, but there are a few key things about which you don't have free will.
Got it. Thank you. Isabella is asking, it's actually related. There are lots of astrologists and online, and they give expensive advice of to pay. Are they trustworthy? And does the advice change depending on who you ask, on when you ask for it?
Well, first of all, it depends on the astrologer. Now, as an astrologer, I thought it would be useful to see how astrologers read. So for like the last 20 years, for my birthday, once a year, I go to a different leading astrologer, not because I need them to read my chart, because I want to see how they read my chart. I want to see how they do it. And they all have very different styles and things. Most of them these days, if they're any good, will, because there's a lot you can read in a chart. You could spend hours and hours. They will ask you what in particular you're interested in. Is it a career thing? Is it health? And they can spend the hour or hour and a half focused on that. Having said that, there are also quite a lot of people that aren't very good at practicing astrology because the barriers to entry with computers are very low now. You can get a computer that will draft the chart, so you don't have to know math, you don't have to understand what's going on. You can create a chart, and with a lot of them come these automatic interpretation programs, which aren't very personal and are very crude. And so somebody can just use those and tear off and do a lot of charts, one after the other, and make money doing it. Most of the really good astrologers now that I've known, they're probably not taking individual readings anymore because they've been doing it so long. They do lectures. And that's the other thing. You can look on YouTube. There are a few really good places. There's something called the Astrology Podcast, which if you're interested in learning more, he's very pedantic, but he's thorough and fair. And he has astrological discussions with different astrologers on different topics. And I would suggest that the astrologers that he talks to, although there's a US bias, but that shouldn't matter these days, are generally of good quality. Okay.
Good advice. Thank you very much. I only have one question, and that's for me. But before I ask it, just want to make sure that you all have a chance to ask questions. If anybody wants to raise hands and just verbalize it.
Also, let us know if this was okay, because I mean, Vicki and I talked about it when we were trying to think of interesting and entertaining topics that were different to make people Zoom. So we need to get a feeling if we're moving in the right direction when the Harvard Club puts together events or not. And I won't be cut to the quick if you say, no, it was a boring evening and I would rather have had my dinner. Okay.
Yeah, it's I mean, I think also millennials, I know some of you are too young to be in that category. They are taking a closer look at astrology and there are different theories. I think it's yeah, I mean, they're skeptics, but I think there is a renewed scrutiny and interest in the topic.
I think skepticism is very healthy, but what I don't think is healthy is dismissing something without learning about it. Okay. And even as you learn about it, I think skepticism is very healthy. Yeah. So there you go.
Great.
So you were going to ask a question?
Yeah, well, no, I don't see any raised hands. So, I'm pretty sick of listening to my voice. So I typed my question out. So Tamara, if you care to, just
Hold on, where do I have to? You're
oh,
asking me to.
should I say it? Okay.
Just read it, yeah. I think your voice is great, Vicky.
Right. Astrology has ancient roots, and it dates back to the times when people observed the planets and stars with the naked eyes. And they believed that everything revolved around the Earth. And then you had Galileo and Copernicus, and then they came up with the realization that the Earth actually revolves around the sun, and then Newton with his, physical laws and his discoveries that, there are laws governing the movements of heavenly bodies. So to what extent did these astrological principles evolve with these paradigm shifts?
Okay, well, a couple of things there. First of all, astrology is as things are seen from Earth. It doesn't mean astrologers believe the Earth was the center of the universe. And in fact, there are documents going back to like the 3rd century BC where they talk about the sun being the center. Because if you're trying to calculate where things are, you'll see that some planets appear to move backwards in the sky and then forwards again. And you soon realize that that's because they're not going around you, they're going around something else, and it's just the relative speeds. That is, by the way, for those of you that hear about it in the news, things like Mercury retrograde. Retrograde means moving backwards. It's not really moving backwards. It's like being passed by a train that's faster, and you sometimes feel like you're going backwards. It's a visual thing. What happened then is there was a person who wasn't really an astrologer. He was kind of a polymath, I guess, in Egypt. He was a Ptolemy, so the ruling family there. And he pulled together a compendium of all the other astrologers and did some interpretation. And he was the person that did 2 things. He's the first person that ever said that the planets had a direct influence on people on Earth. It was never really suggested that that was the mode of working before Ptolemy. And he was the person that said the Earth was the center of the universe. Nobody said it before Ptolemy. And Ptolemy was, with his equals at the time, he was a matter of, great dispute. It's just that he was quite senior in the ruling family in Egypt. So you didn't, you had to be careful what you said. So he wrote a book called Tetrabiblos that this is all in. But if you look at it, Copernicus, who is credited with looking at the heliocentric form of the universe, was an astrologer, as was Galileo, and all these people who are credited with saying this. And the people after that were most offended by it was the Catholic Church. It wasn't astrologers. It doesn't really make any difference when all you're trying to do is map what you see in the sky as you see it from Earth, not that it represents a whole cosmology.
Yeah, I think, thank you very much for making that distinction. I do remember that chart that you showed us. So it's a very succinct answer to a question that is pretty, broad. So thank you. Anybody else has any questions? If not, I just want to thank Tamara. I mean, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for getting the slides together. The visuals are, stunning as well. I don't know if anybody might want copies of this slide. I mean, how do you feel about that, Tamara?
The only way I feel about it is some of the pictures I took from the web, and they're from the Creative Commons, and I didn't leave the attributions on them. So I'm not quite sure legally where there are things like the pictures of the map of the Middle East and things like that. The astrology charts are all fine, but I'm not quite sure legally where I am with nicking stuff off the web and passing it out. So
got it. No worries there. Well, we do have the recording. So we will figure out what to do about that. I think it's all right if, I could just go in and do the, the citations, if that helps, if that reassures you, because we do have the recording.
Okay.
But
okay.
yeah, whatever it's worth, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, and I'm so happy that we have something, slightly different. That's not always doom and gloom and COVID or politics. And yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for participating and asking questions as well. That's appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you again.